theater, and it was so much fun being in a packed theater, hanging out with Brian, seeing that movie. So if anybody hasn't seen it, it's on Netflix. Go watch it. It's the best movie of the year.
Yeah, yeah. I haven't finished RRR, but I really liked it. I was watching it on Netflix. Right before this recording, we were talking about different things that I've like started on Netflix and stuff that I haven't finished. And it's because I'm always watching certain things to review on this channel with Brian. And we've been doing Andor, and we did Tales of the Jedi last week, and then you and I have been doing The Peripheral. And so
Yeah.
far, The Peripheral on Amazon Prime is up to episode 4, and I've been keeping up to date with that one, however. So we're going to talk about that today, you and me. Spoilers for The Peripheral episode 4, if you guys haven't seen it. But I got to admit something right off the bat, Danny, that there's two things. One, I totally didn't know the details about the book, even though I have the book on Audible. I didn't know that it's actually one of 2 books. It's a 2-book series. Did you know
Okay.
that?
No, but that will probably, if there is a season 2, that will probably lead into it. So
Yeah, I'm thinking that like either they'll just cover the second book in season 2, or maybe even not even finish book 1 in season 1 and just kind of keep it going like they sort of did with Game of Thrones. And so the series written by William Gibson is called the Jackpot series. And in this episode, we find out what the jackpot is. They've been talking about the jackpot for a while. But we find out that the jackpot is the apocalyptic event that made the world the way it is in the future that Flynn keeps visiting, right? And so the jackpot, it's really interesting. It's an apocalyptic event, but they say that it's like essentially a bunch of different events that cause the apocalypse. It's not like just one thing where it's like, oh, it's a zombie virus or
yeah,
it's nuclear war. So there's 4 different factors, and they really presented it in a very, very cool way with this like holographic display at the end of the episode. I know I'm kind of shooting my money shot here with the jackpot, but I thought it was really intriguing. Did you think it was
I
really cool how they showed it?
yeah, I liked that the special effects that they use, the way that they go to, like, it's a cemetery, but they call it a museum, I
Nice.
believe,
Yeah.
and all of a sudden, like, these, spheres just start, creating these like 3D images to show what happened in the past. It's a very elaborate way to do exposition,
Mm-hmm.
which I know you're a big, that's one of your pet peeves, is when you spend too much time on exposition. But I thought this
Right.
was a really unique way of doing it. And if you're not familiar with the books, which I'm not, and you're just getting started, it's kind of an important thing if you're going to link these two timelines. Like, we have one, which is, I believe, 2032, 10 years ahead of where we are now. That's the past
Right.
of this show. And
Right.
then you have the future, which is like right on the cusp of 2100. If you're going to link those two timelines and there's going to be this jackpot apocalyptic event, you kind of have to explain what happened. So I thought this was a really unique way of doing that.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I also think it's interesting the way that they did it with, like you said, there's multiple things. I think that's a much more believable apocalypse than to just say, oh, there's all out nuclear war
Right.
or zombie
Yeah.
virus.
Yeah. Yeah.
I like that because history is as a history teacher, you teach through cause and events, turning point moments, all the things that led up to them, and then all of the effects, political, social, and economic effects that happen after. And this to me is a lot more believable. It reminded me, and I just watched it yesterday because it was November 5th. So I watched V for Vendetta
Yes. Yes.
because I remembered the 5th of November. And it's one of my all time favorite movies. And I love how they talk about what led to like the dictatorship growing in England, how it wasn't just one thing. It was the American War spilling over to England. Then there were terrorist attacks. Then there was the St. Mary's virus that spread. And while all of these things were going on, you have the rise of this like far conservative Hitler esque character played by John Hurt, and it makes it more believable than, oh, the people just voted for this crazy person, or at least in 2005 it did.
Jesus.
That movie's
Yeah.
gotten a little scarier as the years have gone by.
Yes, yes. And these post-apocalyptic or dystopian future shows and movies seem a lot more realistic, honestly. You
Yeah,
know?
it kind of felt similar in the way that, like, the collapse of civilization was not just one thing.
Right.
I don't really think that that's a believable thing. Whereas it's this culmination of events.
Right, right. I mean, really, really excellent point. You know, when we're talking about this like history teacher lens that you just mentioned, I mean, even when you look at World War II, people often that's the one where they say Franz Ferdinand was assassinated, right? And that led to it. It's not that's not World War One. That's World War One. Oh boy. All right, well, I'm not the history teacher. You are. But so you know, a lot of people say that's like the inciting incident, but of course, like you said, there's all these different things happening prior to that that like kind of culminate. And so with the jackpot in this series, the jackpot has like an environmental collapse that happens, but even before you get to that, it goes in a certain order. The first thing that happens is a blackout that starts in America. It's really rough, takes off the power in America for a month, and then it kind of spreads worldwide. Then there is this virus that's like this blood plague they describe that is awful. And you go from that to like, I believe they said something like immunity is gone or something like that. Like animals lose their immunity to things. And there's like all this environmental collapse is the third thing. And then the very fourth part of the collapse, which, you know, if you, now that I'm saying this, I don't know why I didn't think about this, but it's almost like the four horsemen of the apocalypse, right?
Yeah,
I don't even know why I didn't think of this, but yeah, like one of them's definitely disease,
pestilence. Yeah,
pestilence, right? That's the second one, and then the fourth one would be war, because they're basically talking about these terrorist attacks. They mentioned this domestic terrorist attack where a nuke is set off within a silo in the United States, and the very last thing that you see that before the credits roll is that Flynn makes the connection that that silo is near where she lives in the past, you know, in the present day setting of the show. So she's wondering if there's some kind of connection to her. Um, and just I wanted to keep talking about this one part because it was so cool, and obviously they thought it was important because it's the very last scene of the show. Um, each different representation of one of these events looks really cool. Like they obviously put a lot of effort into it and they made it very creative. Like when they show the blood plague spreading, they kind of show like a person kind of speared and like held up like a corpse and they sort of start to shrivel. Like it was very much like it reminded me of like when Morpheus is explaining the Matrix to Neo in the first Matrix. Go ahead.
I'm so glad you said that, because there's certain costume choices that are made throughout this episode and throughout the series so far that, as I was watching it, I'm going, this looks very Matrix esque. And I
Yeah.
don't know, did you mention in our first video that we did about the first three episodes that William Gibson's fiction is supposed to be kind of influential to the ideas of the Matrix?
Absolutely,
Oh, okay,
absolutely.
so maybe that's just like a callback to, like, but like at one point when they're wearing black leather trench coats, I'm
Yeah,
like, come on, like
come
this
on
is,
now.
yeah. Uh, but also, the idea of, people bouncing back and forth between different realities slash timelines. It, after 1999, anytime you do that, you're going to be compared to the Matrix.
Yes, yes, it absolutely feels like the Matrix, and I haven't done a lot of research into like what William Gibson feels about the Matrix or about this book in general, but it could be his own personal response to the Matrix. This show is admittedly confusing, right? Like it's
Yeah.
kind of hard. Like there are times when there's dialogue between characters, and I'm like, what the fuck are you explaining here? But from what I glean, it's basically that Flynn lives in this present day time of like 2032, and she's able to, like, through a kind of almost like virtual reality, go into a body in an alternate timeline of like 2075 because it's not her timeline anymore because it's a different timeline. And essentially, just like in Avengers Endgame and stuff, anytime you alter something, it becomes a different timeline. And so the people in the future refer to Flynn as like Polts, which is like short for poltergeists. And they're basically people that can go into these peripherals, which are these like suits that look just like the person, right? And so the people in the future, there's only like three different groups, and one is called the Klept, which is almost like a criminal syndicate, and that's where our main like people that we follow in the future are. They're from that group. Then there's the Research Institute that has Charisse, who is played by that woman from Bly Manor.
Tanaya Miller, yeah.
Tanaya Miller, thank you. You're pretty much always going to say her name, you know, every time. And then there's the Met, which I think kind of is like the police of the future. There's only like three factions, and as we've seen, over 7 billion people died during the jackpot. And so in the future, they're sort of like doing all these experiments, altering timelines to see how it affects the present day or the future. But the people that are in the Klept, which are the main protagonists in the future, apparently they stole something from Tanaya Miller's group, and Tanaya Miller wants to get it back. And I think it's information, as far as I know. That's what I gleaned from all this so far.
I think just in your little synopsis there, and like we made a connection to the Matrix. I think my biggest issue with this show so far is that it feels a lot more like the Matrix sequels than it does the original Matrix.
Okay.
In the sense that, yeah, there's some really cool stuff in there, but it does get bogged down in long conversations that are really confusing to follow, that involve a lot of techno babble that if you're not aware of, like, they just throw the word haptics out there.
Right.
And like you're able to figure them out by like looking at what the characters are. But like when you're basically using an entirely new language, you kind of have to explain that to your audience, or else you're going to just lose your audience pretty quickly. And I did start to find myself drifting a little bit during this episode.
Sure. Oh shit!
To the point where drifting. My camera just gave up. But and I'll. It's funny. I was about to tell you this before we started recording, where Athena and I are watching Interview with a Vampire, and we saw a commercial for the Peripheral, and I said, "Oh, that's the show I'm reviewing with Pete." And she's like, "Oh, it looks kind of cool." I was like, "Well, it looks like there's a lot of action in the show. There's really not that much."
No.
I was like, there's a lot of talking in between these action sequences. And I felt like this episode in particular dragged a little bit, especially compared to the first three. And that first episode, again, feels a million miles away because this character that is driving the plot, Alita, is like an absentee character that we barely got to know. And it's very strange for the show to be going in that direction. Like we have Wilf, who's her brother, and like he has a bond with Flynn from meeting in the future when she's in a peripheral. But it's still a very, very strange. I like one of my favorite things of the show is that human characters from 2032 can put on the headset and go into other bodies. So like they have a peripheral now that is made of Flynn. It's like, so, and then what's his name? Connor, who's a triple amputee from Burton's unit. He puts on the headset and now suddenly he's like a 25-year-old blonde woman, but he has all of his limbs, and he just decides to say like F it, and he goes for like a crazy dash, and he like hops over a fence, and it's like that is really interesting. And I hope they do more stuff like that, because originally it was Flynn in Burton's body in a peripheral, And Burton, I don't think has ever used it yet.
No.
So I'm wondering if the jackpot starting somewhere near Flynn, if it's going to come back, that there's obviously people we've met in her life that could end up being responsible for it. Could it be Burton and his unit? Could it be that the uncle who's like the gangster of the neighborhood, who's got like a crew of dimwits who do all of his bidding? Could it be him? It feels like it's leaning towards them making Burton the villain later on, because he keeps getting frustrated with the fact that he's never actually used the simulator. He's never used a headset. And he's getting, him and Flynn are getting more antagonistic. She's starting to get side effects from using it. She's having a seizure. So I'm really interested to see if they dive into who is responsible for the escalation of the jackpot, and if it's somebody we know from Flynn's timeline.
Yeah. Really, really great point. I read a review where someone was talking about this episode, and they posed that exact question of like, oh, is Burton and his crew somehow connected to that silo explosion that is the fourth part of the jackpot? So I hope I can explain this part without fucking sounding like a lunatic or stumbling over my words. But in the future timeline that we keep seeing with all these characters, that's the part where I get the most confused, first off. And that's where I have the least interest in those characters. I'm much more interested in the stuff that's in 2032. But what I was going to say is, you always have this sense of, well, their life hasn't been affected by time travel because they are creating other timelines, right? But then as you were describing all of this to me, I was like, but wait a minute. Maybe the timeline that they're in has been affected by time travelers in another timeline. So, like, the idea of Burton's crew blowing up that missile, which leads to the jackpot in their life, right? It kind of makes sense to think that time travel affected their timeline, because, like, it'd be weird that like Burton and his people are involved in the jackpot because they seem so removed from everything before all this stuff happens.
Yeah.
They're just kind of living in the woods. They're just drinking beers. They kind of be left alone. And because they get
flying their drones.
Right. Because they get brought into this, then they're much more involved and they can have much more power. So I wonder if, like, because of a different timeline, and see, that's why it's all convoluted. And so one thing I wanted to kind of bring up, like I already said, was that future timeline just is like a lot less interesting to me. And you had this one scene where Charisse meets with Lev, right, who's like the friend of Wolf, and he's like sending him on missions and shit. And honestly, when they were talking, first off, I was like, what the fuck? I mean, she's doing something with toast and she's explaining things. And she did a true exposition dump there. She used like pieces of toast to explain the arrangement in the future, like the different factions. And I was just like, what the fuck is even going on? But like, it's really in that interaction with the past that I like the future stuff. Otherwise, when it's just the future stuff by itself, I'm like confused. I'm kind of bored. One thing I wanted to admit, and I want to see what you said too, is I actually didn't finish episode 3 when we did our review last time. And I actually thought that we did. It's the first time I've ever done this in any of these recordings. I thought the very last scene of episode 3 was when Charisse killed that woman with the bees. But there's shit that happens like after that. There's like a whole action sequence. Do you remember that?
Yes.
Yeah. So that action sequence goes along with what you were saying, how Flynn has this damage from the peripheral. But I didn't realize that until I went back and watched the end of episode 3. Like, she got fucked up by this guy, Daniel, who was like an assassin working for Charisse. He used this like sonic gun on her, fucked up her organs. And so it is like the Matrix, like you said before.
Yeah, that's what I believe broke the Burton peripheral. All the way back in the first episode.
Yeah. And so the question is, like, there's this one part in the first episode which is very upsetting, where the peripheral's eye gets taken out, and you don't make that connection that, oh, this is a robot body and stuff. Like, you don't even know about that stuff yet. And so I keep wondering, why the fuck did they take the eyeball out of the peripheral, you know, in the first episode? Like, what's the point of that? What is that? What that has to have some kind of meaning.
Didn't they need to get into someplace and they needed to replace that eye with the eye to get into the again,
Okay.
that first episode feels a million years ago.
Yes.
It really does. And you know, to again, I feel like I'm beating a dead horse with my Matrix analogies and connections. Will you two stop it? Two cats having a battle royal over here. When in the Matrix, you have two groups.
Yes.
You have Neo, and then you have the group that is trying Morpheus, Trinity, that whole group that is trying to they wake him up, and then they go they spend a lot of time like settling him into his new environment and introducing the characters, explaining this and that. And yet it feels like as an audience member, you're kind of being led, but you also kind of need to understand what's going on here. And like Morpheus, like basically walks him literally through, like, this is the Matrix. This, did you look at the woman in red? You like, it's all of that stuff. And then you have the agents, and you have clearly defined characters. I feel like there's so many characters, and
yes.
so like when Charisse, after episode 3, where she has those two great moments where she like basically threatens to kill the guy, Daniel, I think that was, the hitman, and then she like makes the floor disappear under the skyscraper and then walks across it and then kills the woman with the bees. And then in this episode, she just sits down with Lev. And my first thought is, wait, who's this now? Like, is he with them? Why is he talking to her? I was just like, I really hope that the show picks up a little bit and kind of like brings the characters together so that we can get some like some faster paced stuff where it's not just individual sets of characters having conversations. Like at one point, Wilf is dancing with this woman, and I'm like, I have no idea. Like at this point, like that's Lev's wife? So what? Huh?
Yeah.
And it's like the show has so many good ideas, but I feel like the structure of the show is bogging it down. And like you, I'm a lot more interested in Flynn and Burton and the crazy uncle and this gang of like former military guys who fly drones and drink beer and are still freaking elite killers when they're faced with like trouble. I'm much more into that. I'm much more into Connor, the triple amputee who kicks ass. I love that character. And then they go into the future with the peripherals, and I'm just kind of like, well, the architecture is really cool, and those special effects are cool, but it just feels like I'm being told a lot of stuff without being told anything. Does that make sense?
Absolutely, yes.
Okay.
Yes. I think that you're going to get what you are wishing for, though, because by the end of this episode, they're establishing that Flynn wants there to be 2 other peripherals with her. She wants one for Connor, and she wants one for Burton. So I think that those 3 are going to be a part of the future now, too, with Flynn. So we'll see a lot more of like the characters all together in the future. That scene that you're talking about where Wilfred is dancing with Lev's wife, I was super confused too. I'm like, what does this woman matter? Like, what's going on here? And there are a shit ton of characters. There's this whole sequence where like Flynn is trying to stay in her peripheral, but they keep trying to kick her out. And there are these hackers working on both sides in the future and in the present day. I'm like, who are these people? I barely know that one Asian woman that has like the Irish accent. I'm like, okay, there's this random lady with the tattoos that move. But what I was going to ask you was, did you watch any of Westworld on HBO?
No, but I was going to bring that up because I know Westworld just got canceled, and that and that is always my apprehension with starting a new, especially sci-fi themed series. Like we
Yeah.
ran into this with Raised by Wolves, which I think we will both agree at this point we loved Raised by Wolves a lot more than this. Like
Yeah.
this is okay, but Raised by Wolves was so good. And it ended and then they canceled it. And
Right.
Westworld was one of the most successful, or at least most talked about shows. And apparently, it was like ending on a. I didn't watch it, but apparently, season 4 ended on a cliffhanger. They were all set for a final season, and it's canceled. So
Yeah.
now it's like you've invested all these years and all this time into a series for what?
Yeah.
And somebody put out a tweet where they were like, this is why I like movies, because unless you're watching like franchise entry number 2 in a trilogy, you're almost guaranteed to get a finite ending at the end of a movie.
Right.
and
Right.
and that's always where I've been. That's why I'm such a movie fan, because it's like after 90 minutes to 2 hours, if I didn't like this movie, then I never have to think about it again.
Right.
But in that same span of 90 minutes to 2 hours, to watch 2 episodes out of maybe 30, and then for it all just to not end, or to get an unsatisfactory conclusion, it's just it just always led me more to movies over TV, no matter how good TV has gotten in the last 20 years. Which I think most with streaming and with HBO and their series, everything from like The Sopranos on, like the golden age of episodic television,
Yeah.
from Lost and The Sopranos up to now.
Yeah.
I'll still just take like last night. I went RRR 3 hours and 10 minutes, as it is more enjoyable in 3 hours and 10 minutes than any 3 1-hour episodes of a TV show I can imagine.
Right. Right. Yeah. I mean, there's definitely more like people kicking tigers in the face and stuff, and guys like holding each other over a burning bridge. I got to finish that one. But what I was gonna say was, the reason why I brought up Westworld in particular is because Christopher Nolan's brother, I believe his name is Jonathan Nolan, he is the showrunner of Westworld, right? And I'm going to give you like a little bit of a spoiler for Westworld. Hopefully, you forget this detail. But in the first season, there's like multiple storylines going on, and you don't realize that the two main storylines are not happening at the same time. Like one is actually happening a bit further in the past, and one is happening in the present. But because we're dealing with robots and stuff, and the way they filmed it, it seems like it's all happening in the present because the robots don't age, right? So they're interacting with characters in the past and in the present, and it's kind of confusing. And for a while, you're wondering like, what the fuck is going on? And it seems like that's kind of Jonathan Nolan's MO. And a lot of Westworld is philosophizing about consciousness and what is reality and things like that. So when I knew he was
Do
taking
you
on
mean
this,
to tell me that a Nolan brother is a bit pretentious?
yes, I'm making that bold statement there. Yeah, yeah. And I
You know
don't
what?
know Jonathan's involvement on Tenet, but I mean that also has to do with time travel and stuff too. I don't know if he wrote that at
I
all.
I have not seen Tenet, and
Ditto.
I even thought about it yesterday. Like, I think that's a movie I'm comfortable never watching, just
Yeah.
because I wasn't a fan of the whole Christopher Nolan, like, you must see it in a movie theater even if it means you die by COVID thing.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
just in general, like, I haven't heard anybody come out and say it's breathtaking. I've heard many more people say it's intentionally confusing and gives you a headache. And I'm like, what? Why would I want to sit there for 3 hours?
Right.
I'd much rather watch Interstellar, which I have still never seen, but everybody loves this movie. And I'm like, okay, if everybody is raving about it, I will. I'd rather sit down for 3 hours and watch that
Yeah.
instead of Tenet.
I mean, that's a complete movie in itself, just like what you were talking about, was so great. Like you don't have to watch anything else. And if it ever is playing at like a theater, like I know that you go to a lot of screenings and stuff. If they're ever showing that again in the theater, I highly recommend watching that in the theater versus like on your TV or your phone. But bringing it back to the Peripheral, there's just a few little last points I want to make before we get into the end of this or we wrap this up. Um, so yeah, the stuff with the future is confusing, and they still kind of are. I mean, the main drive is this Alita character, which you said is absent. But it seems like she has some kind of information that affects the research institute, Sharice's group, and what they're doing in the past. Now, the one part I disliked the most about this episode, I wanted to bring this up, was that Lev is having this conversation with Wilf, and he mentions how he sent people to kill his family, like an alternate version of his family. And one thing that happened was Wilf had this conversation with Flynn, and she mentioned that she looked up this Lev character in the present day, and there was a Lev in the present day, but that his family was murdered and their house was set on fire. Now that got really, really confusing to me because I was like, wait a minute. So is that like Lev's descendants that were murdered and they just happen to have the same name? Is this guy Lev somehow in that time and now he's in like a peripheral or something in this future time? That was very, very confusing to me, that one scene.
Yeah.
It really took me out of it. So, I mean, and honestly, I'm not very interested in him. The two scenes that I got the most bored involved that guy Lev. It was like when he was talking to Wilf and when he was talking to Sharice. And it's like, I still don't really get what you're saying. They keep implying that like he's part of the Klept and that the Klept is very dangerous. And so he's a very dangerous person. Obviously, him talking about killing his own family shows that he is very dangerous. But like, I'm just not invested in him at all. And I don't care,
Yeah, no, I'm with you.
Yeah. So, just like last thing I want to say was that uh, the action in the show can be kind of intense and good. In the last episode, we didn't talk about it because I totally didn't even see it. But there was this battle with the guy Daniel, who was like an assassin working for Sharice, and he uses that weapon on Flynn's peripheral, and then he says something that makes Sharice want to kill him, and so the robot, the android that's with him, like slices his throat with his blade. And I thought that whole sequence was great. And I also do think that all the stuff with the robots is really cool, just in general. Like visually, they look cool.
Yeah.
And then there's robot stuff. Obviously, like Westworld's all about androids, but they even have weird ones that don't have faces and stuff too. And they always looked cool in Westworld. But in this episode, Sharice is with an android that essentially has like the face of the Daniel guy that she killed, and she's trying to make him be similar to the Daniel that she worked with, and so she's adjusting his voice, adjusting his
And
personality.
didn't Wilp's mom have a peripheral with Alita's face also?
So I don't think that those are considered peripherals. I might be wrong. I
Or
think
just like an android with
right. I think they're just androids basically. I think a peripheral is like a person goes into it kind of thing.
Okay.
But I just always like things like that. I've seen that in science fiction many, many times where like there's a person that's dead and then they try to like replace
I
them
heard
up.
you not to plug our other channel, but I heard you mention this in you, Gage Greenwood, and Daniel, what's Daniel's last name?
Barnett.
When you guys talked about the first 4 episodes of Cabinet of Curiosities.
There you go.
And over on the Lassercast, and you mentioned that about how that's like one of your favorite things where like a body is possessed by something else, and there's a lot of that in what was that, the autopsy, right?
The autopsy. Yes.
That was a really good episode.
Yes.
I'm sorry I missed that meeting, but I'll be there for the next one. I'm about to finish Cabinet of Curiosities.
Boom. I love the little plug for the Lassercast in there too. But like that's something that they do a lot in Westworld and in sci-fi movies with androids in general. I mean, AI is a big example of like sort of replacing loved ones or valuable people with androids that are supposed to be like them. That happens very, very often. And so that's happening on this show too.
I mean, and uh, it kind of feels like that movie Megan that's about to come out. You know,
Yes,
where I
that
mean, they're not replacing anybody, but it's like the idea of the android is so lifelike that it replaces human kind to this young girl. Uh, and that movie looks like it's going to be a lot more fun than it has any right to be.
yes, agreed. I already saw people with Halloween costumes of that, like on TikTok and stuff. And
Oh wow!
the movie hasn't even fucking come out yet, you know. But it sounds like we are more excited to talk with each other about things besides the peripheral. Hopefully, by next week with episode 5, it kind of comes around more and we're more engaged with it. I think that we're both in agreement that like the talk of the jackpot itself was like pretty interesting and exciting.
Oh,
That last
definitely,
scene,
yeah.
but otherwise, the future stuff I think needs some help. So we'll see next week what's coming out, like how it is the episode. But we'll continue till the show's over. I think that season 2 already has been approved too, so we'll see. But
All right.
on this channel on Comic Books Transformed, Brian and I are going to be talking about Andor next weekend, and then we're also going to be talking about Wakanda Forever. So, and we might even give Transformers Earthspark, the new kids cartoon, a try and see if it's worth talking about. But Danny, on the Lasercast, do you want to just plug what we got going on over there too?
Well, it's funny. We were just mentioning we don't have anything specifically going on in the sense that a lot of the stuff we were covering has come to an end. So we had talked about covering AMC's Interview with a Vampire, which has been a much more entertaining and violent and just awesome horror show. Much better than I had any hopes for. I really looking forward to talking about that. Then I missed this week's episode of Chucky just because I had so much going on in the middle of the week. But next week, I'm going to do a double review of episodes 4 and 5. This was a freaking phenomenal episode of Chucky this week with Jennifer Tilly as a huge standout. And we owe you on the Lasercast some coverage of the Midnight Club. And as soon as Pete finishes, we're going to do a season recap of the Midnight Club on Netflix. And I will be there for the second set of Cabinet of Curiosities, Guillermo del Toro's Netflix series. It's 8 really short horror movies. They're an hour long each. There's nothing episodic about it. They're just 8 individual horror stories. Almost feels like an elongated Tales from the Crypt show. And I missed out on, there's a great review from Pete, Gage Greenwood, and Daniel Barnett up on our channel now. And I will be there for the next 4 episodes to talk about it as well. So, yeah, I think that's it.
Nice, my man. Yes. So please, if you have not already, subscribe to both Comic Books Transformed and the Lasercast, where I'm always on each of them, but Daniel's on the Lasercast, and then Brian is here with me on Comic Books Transformed. And we're just middle-aged dudes that love talking about the stuff that you are interested in, and we're giving our perspective, and we would always, always love to hear yours too. But until then, Danny and I will be back here next weekend to talk about The Peripheral episode 5.